Hi, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on creativity. So to start, I'm going to do a bit of an expanded review and teach you all about creativity and free association. So here's an outline, just so you're aware of kind of what we're going to get into. But first, I'm going to start out with what is creativity? So creativity is a combination of associative and executive processes. We want spontaneous thought and mind wandering, response chaining, and retrieval from memory, but we also want to use our working memory and have a good processing speed and inhibit responses that are not useful. Brain research supports this theory that creative thinking relies on both associative and executive brain processes, and the brain networks relevant for associative and the brain networks relevant for executive couple up during creative ideation. So I'm going to focus this video on the associative side of creativity, because people who are more creative seem to have lots of connections between common and uncommonly connected concepts, while people who are less creative have much stronger connections between common concepts. I'm going to elaborate on the brain networks relevant to associative processes, and I'm going to use a study that looks at a specific associative thinking task and how it correlates to activity in the regions of interest and levels of creativity in the patient. So let's get into what associative thinking is. Association is how one concept links to others in memory. Creative thinking has long been conceptualized as involving an associative process over memory, where concepts are combined to form new and effective ideas. However, it's been historically challenging to study, and a lot of gaps in the research on what processes involve associative thinking and how exactly the structures in the brain associated with associative thinking work in creative processes. So now let's look at association in the brain. Most of it is centralized in the default mode network, which includes the posterior cingulate cortex, or the PCC, the precuneus, or the PC, the medial prefrontal cortex, or the MPFC, and those are all marked here. It also includes the inferior parietal lobes, the temporal parietal junctions, the middle temporal gyrus, and the medial temporal lobe. So the exact roles of the DMN involvement in human cognition are not totally determined, but evidence from numerous studies shows that it is involved generally in inward directed and self-generated thought, which includes things like searching in memory, spontaneous thinking, and mind wandering. It also includes spontaneous associative thinking, which is something that we're going to focus on a lot. However, researchers are still only beginning to understand how different parts of the default mode network support spontaneous ideation in general. So now I want to focus on this idea of how do we isolate associative processes if both associative and executive processes are both part of creative cognition. So to isolate associative processes from executive ones, we've hypothesized that something called free association tasks can do this. So there are three types of free association tasks. There are single word associations, continuous associations, and chain free associations. They all verbalize spontaneous thought that arrives in a person's mind without any strict task criteria. So for example, the instructions would be say a word that comes to mind instead of say words that start with K. As a side note, there's new natural language processing technology that can be used to create distributional semantic networks between words and concepts that measure the semantic distance between different ideas, which is a measure of relatedness between two words or concepts. So we can really operationalize how far apart different words in a free association task are. So by definition, free association tasks seem to rely on spontaneous associative processes. We will get back to that seem later. For now, we're going to focus on chain-free association. So chain-free association is when you verbalize a chain of single associations based on the word ahead of it, and you start at a seed word that's given. There are very low constraints to this task because each word doesn't have to relate back to the starting word. So it's been hypothesized that it would be a good task to demonstrate free association and spontaneous thought. You can use chain association tasks to measure something called associative flexibility, which is the ability to flexibly produce ideas from diverse concepts. In CFAs, it's measured by how many discriminable concepts are included in the word association chains a person generates. So studies have shown a clear relationship between creativity and flexibility scores on CFA tasks. So the CFA scores predict originality scores on common creativity tasks. However, there's a gap in this research, which is that it actually hadn't been empirically confirmed that CFA is relevant or related to spontaneous associative processes. Sorry. It's just an assumption based off of the definition of the task that, like, of course it would, but nobody had empirically proved it. So that brings us to this study that I read, which investigates the neural mechanisms underpinning chain free association to see if the same neural mechanisms are activated in CFA as are activated in spontaneous associative processes and creative processes. So the researchers who conducted this are from Bar Ilan University and Tel Aviv University in Israel. And they hypothesized three different things. First, that the default mode network will be more active during chain-free association tasks than the control of more goal-related searches because free association involves less restricted internal search. So essentially, this would suggest that chain-free association is related to spontaneous associative processes, which, as I said before, hasn't been empirically proved before. So their second hypothesis is that higher scores on behavioral measures derived from CFA will be related to enhanced involvement of the default mode network and lowering activation of executive-related neural processes. So this would then suggest that CFA is related to spontaneous associative processes and not executive processes, which would differentiate the two in this experiment. So then for the third hypothesis, the researchers thought that scores on CFA tasks would be related to different measures of creative ability, which suggests that CFA, and if it's related to spontaneous associative processes, those two are related to creativity. So for the experiment setup, 36 healthy participants from a university in Tel Aviv and a wide range of members were the patients. And first, they had participants do control tasks related to semantic and episodic memory, as well as phonemic fluency, which is like saying words as they come to mind, so that the results weren't accidentally affected by those factors. And then also before screening, the participants did 3 standard creativity tests to get a score for creativity, and they used this test called a PET, which is the Israeli equivalent of the SAT, as an approximation of intelligence to also control for that. Obviously, there are some shortcomings with these measures. We don't tend to like to measure intelligence with the SAT, but it's an okay standardized approximation. So then for the experiment itself, the researchers did a bunch of tasks while using fMRI imaging. So the first task, which is the one that we were mostly focused on, is the free association task, where participants were instructed to generate single words that arose in their minds, following a given stimulus word in an association chain manner. Then there were also 3 tasks that I won't get into the details of that were the phonemic fluency task, the semantic memory task, and the episodic memory task. So for the free association task, I'm going to now go into how it was scored. So each chain was given a fluency score and a flexibility score and a semantic distance score. The fluency score reflected the number of associations made. The associative flexibility score calculated the number of discriminable concepts included in the chain. And this was determined by a panel of expert judges. And a semantic remoteness score was the average of the semantic distances between the elements of the chain, also determined by a panel of judges. So in understanding the results, they used the results of the 3 control tasks to try to isolate the regions of the brain stimulated by only the free association tasks as much as possible. So now for the results. The free association's fluency scores strongly correlated with creative test fluency scores, which is the AUT here. And the free association flexibility scores correlated with the creative test creative quality scores, but not with fluency, which aligns with the hypothesis that the flexibility and spontaneous associative processes involved are separate from the more executive process fluency score. So one thing that was against the hypothesis, however, was that no correlation was found with semantic distance scores on the CFA tasks with the creative quality on the creative tasks like the AUT. But then again, with the hypothesis, there was no correlation found between the free association measures and the intelligence test scores, which is the PET, or the executive function focused creativity test, which is the RAT. So then if we shift our focus to this brain diagram, this is kind of showing that there was a correlation of brain activity in the regions of interest in the DMN and measures of chain free association performance. So fluency scores strongly correlated in the MPFC, which is over here, and the left SFG, which is right here. Semantic distance strongly correlated in the PCC over here. So the greater the distance semantically, the more PCC activation. And there was a negative correlation between free association flexibility and left IFG activity. And IFG is a major node in the executive function network. So that all continues to go along with the hypotheses. So in summary, the findings showed that engagement in chain FA elicited heightened DMN activity correlated with behavioral measures of chain free association, which in turn correlated with creative performance, but no correlation between free association performance and intelligence. So to get into the significance of this experiment, it's really cool that this was the first experiment to establish that the default mode network substantially was involved in processes of verbalizing train of thought and chain free association. It also established that chain-free association is more spontaneous in nature than semantic and episodic memory retrieval and the phonemic fluency tasks, which were those control tasks. And then this research also suggests that default mode network activity and activity in executive areas seen is widely associated with creative idea production. So CFA is probably likely a form of creative thought. There are some opportunities for further research, though. The first is still, we don't really know how the default mode network and its regions work together and with the IFG and the executive processes in CFA tasks. And then secondly, this study used tasks related specifically to verbal creativity. So it would definitely be interesting to see how creativity looks in the brain when expressed in different domains. And that segues very nicely into the next two sections. So in summary, creativity uses both associative and executive processes. We focused on associative processes and looked at an experiment that related chain-free association tasks to the default mode network in the brain. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the next sections.